Hi everyone, and welcome to the Week 3 lecture on research ethics. Some of the conversation may be a little bit difficult today because of the content, so do take care of yourselves and switch off the lecture when you need to. First up, I'm going to go back to Week 1 and the Week 1 reading by Johnny Saldana when he said, "I've made my fair share of mistakes in the field and fucked up pretty bad on 2 occasions with my work. Both times it was one of those I didn't see it coming moments. I learned from that and moved on and vowed to keep my eyes wide open so it hopefully never happens again. But there comes a time when you just got to get to the bottom line, and to those who just go on and on about ethics, I really want to say, what part of 'but first do no harm' do you not understand?"
A couple of points there. I think when you're doing research, do be prepared for some of those moments that you don't expect to come. And I'm going to tell you some stories of times when I've messed up and where I wasn't expecting it to happen. But I want you to take seriously the idea of ethics. Today you might think I'm going on and on about ethics and I should just say, but first do no harm. That is an important principle to abide by, and it's our first principle. However, life is complex, so you might have the intention of doing no harm and yet do some harm. So that's why I thought I'd tell you 2 stories of where I've messed up while doing research. And then I'm going to go through the ethics guidelines that I'm obliged to adhere to when doing research here at the University of Adelaide. And by the time I'm finished doing that, you'll have had a chance to think about whether, in those 2 situations I told you about, whether I violated any ethical principles. So think about the stories, and then as I go through the lecture, think about possible ethics violations. Way back in 2003, I was doing a PhD and I was exploring the experience of women in a particular Christian denomination, Christian Science. It's a very small church. It was founded by a woman in the 19th century in America. Although it's an international denomination, the vast majority of adherents are in America, which I found out through a whole lot of text-based research that I was doing. So I decided to go to America and interview some women. Oh, I should say that Christian Science and Scientology are not the same. Christian Science is 19th century woman founded, Scientology is 20th century male founded. Both are American though. Anyway, I had 3 groups of women I was interviewing. Women who were still in the church, women who had left the church, and women who had left the church organisation but not the theology. And this last group was a significant gap in the literature because no one else had talked to women who had left the official organisation but who were still attached to the ideas and in some sense still practiced the religion. I started off in Los Angeles, and then I went to San Francisco, then I went to the Midwest, to a couple of states there, then on to Boston and Washington and New York, and eventually on home. Most of the interviews I'd organised from Australia, and I'd used a sampling method called snowballing, which I'll talk about more next week. Basically, I told people I knew in the Christian Science community about my project, and then they told other people, and those other people told others, and then people came to me and asked to be included in the interviews. While I was in San Francisco, I had an appointment with a woman who was studying at one of the universities there, and I'd never met the woman. Everything was organised via email. On this day I was running late, and although I can't remember for the life of me why. Was I late because I got lost? Very possible. Or had another interview run over time? Very possible. But I actually can't recall why I was late. But I rang the woman and asked if we could organise another time that suited her. And on the phone, she was perfectly okay with that. And I arranged eventually to meet her just an hour later than I otherwise would have been. But by the time I got to that meeting, and I wasn't late for the second meeting, and I had to ring upstairs for her to let me into the apartment block, she was agitated. We didn't do the interview in her apartment. She walked me off another couple of streets away to where her caravan was parked. And on the way, she kept on talking about how she didn't know if she could go ahead with this interview. She was only meeting me because her partner encouraged her to. And I was really puzzled. Apart from being late, I hadn't done anything wrong that I could tell. I'd called, explained, apologised and organised another time, but she was absolutely very agitated. Once we got to the interview, when that was underway, I realised why she was so discombobulated. And that was because she disclosed that she had been sexually abused as a child by her father. I wasn't prepared for that. That wasn't a part of the project at all. I had no reason to suspect that, I'll call her Susan, I had no reason to suspect that Susan was going to talk about having been abused. It wasn't part of the brief. My interest was in women's experience of their church. By the time Susan had told, so I was a bit flabbergasted by that, but by the time she told me the story, Susan was so much calmer, obviously feeling better. And as the conversation went on, we had a chat, towards the end, and she asked if I was going to go to Illinois because there's a Christian Science college there and it's quite an important community. I said yes and told her the name of a couple in the church community that I was going to stay with in Illinois. And that had all happened through this snowballing approach. I'd been invited by this couple to stay with them. They rented out rooms at a very reasonable rate for visitors, and they said, hey, come and stay with us. When I told Susan the story, she told me they were her parents, and I was absolutely horrified. By this time, of course, in her life, Susan had confronted her father. He'd denied what he had done. Her mother did believe her, and she had lots of support around her. I was horrified. When I asked if she'd prefer that I not stay with her father, Susan said, no, that's fine, but don't tell them you've interviewed me. Don't tell them anything about me. And of course, I was very happy to do that. I went off to Illinois, and Susan's parents met me at the airport. They were so kind and so generous. I stayed in their home. They chauffeured me around, introduced me to other members of the community. They provided meals. I took them out for dinner. And during that whole time, I was unbelievably uncomfortable. I'm never quite sure whether I did the right thing or not in staying with them. There was no harm to Susan in me staying there. But I think there might have been some harm to me because I was the one who was quite distressed. What I did in that case was ring home and ring my PhD supervisor. I was reassured that if I was safe, then I was okay to continue staying on. And a couple of days later, I moved on to Kentucky and another very different interview. So that's one story in two parts. The fact that I was late and inadvertently caused distress by reorganising a meeting, and then caused distress for myself by unwittingly organising to stay with an interviewee's abusive father, a man who had caused harm and who I knew to be prominent and well respected in the Christian Science community, and I couldn't say a word. That's my first story. My second story is one of tremendous embarrassment. It's about 10 years later, and I'm doing a project on the history of foster care in Australia. And you probably know that if a child is in foster care, they're living with a family that's not their birth family. I was interviewing three groups again, people who had been in foster care as children, people who were foster carers both in the past and at present, and people who were siblings in a foster care family. So they were the biological children of the foster carers. I did interviews over the phone, via Skype and in person, and I travelled interstate for some of those interviews. I interviewed one woman in South Australia, and through the ethics process, we had set up safety protocols. And I was interviewing her in a home. She wasn't coming to the university. Because I was going to a home, I let my colleague in Melbourne know where I was, and I let her know when I'd finished the interview and left her home. It was a precaution around safety. For that particular project, what we were doing was having all of the interviews transcribed. We didn't do that ourselves. And then we were sending the transcriptions back to the interviewees and getting them to check to see if we'd made any mistakes, if there was anything they'd like to change or add. But when it came to this woman, I'll call her Debbie, when it came to Debbie, I didn't have a transcript. My recording equipment had failed, so I didn't have anything to get transcribed. I had nothing to send back to Debbie. I had an outline of the story as I remembered it, but I didn't have any of the detail and I didn't have any direct quotes that I might have used. So I pondered that for a very long time, thought about what to do, and eventually I contacted Debbie. I was honest, told her about my equipment, how that had failed, and asked her if she'd mind if I came and did another interview. And she was very kind, very happy to do that, thank goodness. I did the interview again in the same place. I left the interview, checked the recording, and I had no recording. No recording a second time. That had never happened before, and it's never happened since. My equipment has only ever failed once, and it happened to fail that one time with that same woman, Debbie. This time I sat down as soon as I got back to the office and I wrote up her story straight away, everything I could remember. And then I sent those notes, those field notes to her, but I never told her that I'd lost the recording a second time. Did I do the right thing? When I wrote up the chapter which contained Debbie's story, I did send it to her to check, and she made changes, she added bits, and that was all very good. And when the book was published based on our project, I sent her a copy of that, but I never told her about the recording. When it comes to talking about ethics in research, we're talking about standards for behaviour when we're conducting that research. We are talking about morality. We are absolutely talking about what's right and what's wrong. And there's a shift of focus. We're shifting the focus from doing the project to thinking about the impact of the project on those involved. So the researcher, the research participants, the research organisation, wider research communities, and of course the general public. In Australia, all social research conducted by government organisations must be approved by a Human Research Ethics Committee, and we have one of those set up at the University of Adelaide. Australian universities via Universities Australia have joined together with the National Health and Medical Research Council and the Australian Research Council to produce a national statement on ethical human research. They did that in 2007. So all of our 39 universities across the country, the public universities, have that as their guidelines, and that was then updated in 2018. So what is involved in human research as opposed to research with animals, for example? So what is human research? These examples I'm taking from that national statement I just talked about. So it means taking part in surveys, interviews, focus groups, undergoing psychological, physiological or medical testing or treatment, being observed by researchers, researchers having access to people's personal documents or other materials, collecting and the use of body organs, tissues or fluids, even the exhaled breath of people, and then access to people's individual information, particularly information that's individually identifiable, re-identifiable, or even in non-identifiable form as part of an existing published or unpublished source or database. There are 4 values and principles of ethical conduct: respect, research merit and integrity, justice and beneficence. And I'm going to go through those in a little bit more detail. But I just wanted to point out, first of all, that among those values, and this is according to the national statement, and I'm quoting here, respect is central. It involves recognising that each human being has value and that this value must inform all interaction between people. Such respect includes recognising the value of human autonomy, which is the capacity to determine one's own life and make one's own decisions. But respect, providing for the protection of those with diminished or no autonomy, goes further than this. It also involves, as well as empowering them where possible and protecting and helping people wherever it would be wrong not to do so. Research merit and integrity means that the project must be justifiable because of potential benefits, and that can be to knowledge, to the community, to researchers. In the example of the Christian Science project that I told you about that I did for my PhD, the benefit there was really to knowledge, because there was that huge gap in knowledge around women talking about their experience of the religion. Most of the knowledge was centered on the novelty of a woman founder of religion. So there was that one gap that not much had been taken into account of women's experience of the religion, and there was that other gap that I found, that where women's experience had been explored, the fact that women had left the religion or left the organised religion but not left the theology, that had been totally ignored. When it came to the history of foster care, the benefit was wider than to knowledge. It included knowledge, but it was to the community as well. We'd had a number of inquiries from the 1990s in state care, for example, about the treatment of children in state care, but much of that had focused on people who had been raised in orphanages and children's homes. And even though the majority of children across the country had been in foster care, that focus on children's homes and orphanages meant that kids in foster care, people who'd have grown up in foster care, had been excluded. So this was an opportunity for them to talk about their experience. The project has to be based on a search of current or prior studies, so you have to have a look at the literature, explore what the gaps are. You can't just decide you're going to do something random and not have a look at what's already been done. So you need to put your project into the context of a larger conversation around the topic. The project needs to be designed so that respect for participant is not compromised by the aims of the project, not by the methods, and not by the results. Use appropriate facilities at the university. If you're going to people's homes, then there'll be safety protocols involved. And you need to conduct your research honestly. And also an important point is that everything needs to be available for scrutiny. So for all of those projects, I still have all of that data, so somebody could come back to me and check to see whether my interpretation was valid. So everything's still available for checking for scrutiny. The idea around the principle of justice is that research has to be fair. The selection, exclusion, and inclusion of research participants must be fair, and it must be described in the results. Now, an example I can talk about there from the History of Foster Care project is that when we set that up, we didn't specifically say that we were looking at the history of state foster care, so state mandated or statutory foster care in Australia. We said that we were looking at the history of foster care, but I guess in our minds we had state care there, because one day a woman came and said to me, look, I'm really interested in your project. I'd like to be involved, but I don't know if I can be because I wasn't in state care. My grandfather had organised me to be in foster care, and I'd been in foster care for a number of years. So I went back and I talked to my colleague on the project, and we thought, well, it would be unfair to exclude this woman from the project because we hadn't specified specifically state care, even if it had been in our minds, and so it would have been unfair to exclude her. And in actual fact, we had quite a number of people who'd been in foster care, but the state had not been involved in organising that. It had been family members. The recruitment of your research participants needs to be fair. There needs to be no unfair burden on particular groups, and often I think that there has been an unfair burden on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island community, particularly when they've been researched by white fellas. And another thing I think of, that often what we're doing when we're doing research is looking down the social hierarchy, and perhaps that's an unfair burden there, and we should be looking up to higher levels of the hierarchy and see what's going on there. There needs to be a fair distribution of benefits of participation in the project, and that's one that I still question, because particularly for the History of Foster Care project, I did interview people who were some of the poorest people in our community in terms of economics. They really didn't have much in the way of money. And I kept on thinking that, well, here was I doing this project, and I benefit in terms of my career, no doubt about that. But did I really benefit equally, fairly? Was there a fair distribution of benefits for other participants? So that's something that continues to bother me a little bit. We need to make sure that there's no exploitation of participants when doing the research, and there needs to be fair access to benefits of that research. In terms of my own projects, what I've always done is actually send people copies of the book. So I did that with the Christian Science project, and I did that with the History of Foster Care. So at least that was something that I could do for the participants at the end of those projects. And even though, to be honest, and I probably shouldn't be saying this, that was not a part of the ethics process, I did that after the project. If we're going to say that there are benefits of a project, then we must be able to justify any risks of harm or discomforts. And I'm thinking there of benefits to the participants or to the wider community. And that was particularly a concern for me in the History of Foster Care project, because I had to take into account that I might be talking to people who'd experienced considerable trauma, and the talking to them might actually trigger trauma again. They might be re-traumatized by that. So we needed to take into account that the benefits would justify that possibility. And it's the same for a current project that I'm doing. Again, I'll be talking to people who've been in what's called out-of-home care, whether they've been in foster care or some sort of kinship care or some other sort of residential care arrangement. The project is to talk to people, and we have been able to justify that the benefit will outweigh any possibility of harm, and harm in this case would be people becoming distressed or feeling re-traumatized. So researchers must design research that minimises the risk of harm or discomfort to participants, and in our participant information sheet, a sheet that goes out to participants to let them know about the project, we do include a protocol if they become upset, and that includes, if somebody becomes distressed, then we will stop. We'll make sure that they're okay, make sure that they have support when they leave us, give them referrals to support organisations, follow up and the following day or as soon as possible, and make sure that they are okay. In that same participant information sheet, we're very clear with participants on the potential benefits and the risks of the research. So we will talk about that possibility there. In the current project, I've been required by the Ethics Committee to let people know that if they are currently having treatment for any trauma as a result of their childhood experiences, that they won't be able to participate in the project. That's one of the limits, and so we won't, because we don't want to exacerbate any of that. Researchers are absolutely responsible for the welfare of participants when doing research with them, hence the reason why we have very clear protocols what we're going to do. And if you go through an HREC, Human Research Ethics Committee, you'll be required to do that sort of protocol to make sure that participants are safe, because that's your responsibility when you're doing research. When we're talking about a risk of harm, it does include physical harm, things like injury, illness, causing any physical pain. But we're also talking about psychological harm, so eliciting feelings of distress or even guilt or fear or anger, feelings of worthlessness or embarrassment, being humiliated, being manipulated and being treated unfairly. These are all considerations that we must take into account. Any sort of social risk would be discrimination against people, stigmatization, any sort of damage to the networks and relationships. Economic harm might be direct or indirect costs to research participants financially. So these are all the risks that we need to take into account. The final one I wanted to mention is legal, the discovery of criminal conduct. And in my participant information sheets for the History of Foster Care project and for the current project that I'm working on, we do have built in there a statement that we're not seeking any knowledge of criminal conduct, but if we are told about it, then we're obliged to report that. Now, I would be obliged to report that to our Human Research Ethics Committee, and then I'd leave it to them to deal with. I haven't had to do that, but I have had that built in because it might come up in conversation. So it's a warning to people of what will happen if they mention something during the course of the interview. If you were doing a project that had a low risk, what's called a low risk review for the HREC, that would mean that there's really just a risk of discomfort, not distress, discomfort. So examples might be minor side effects of medication, perhaps people might feel anxious doing an interview. Where a person's reactions exceed discomfort and become distressed, they should be viewed as harms, and that's from the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research. A couple of quotes here from the National Statement. The expression low-risk research describes research in which the only foreseeable risk is one of discomfort. Say, for example, a bit of anxiety about doing an interview. Research in which the risk for participants is more serious than discomfort is not low risk. The expression, and I'm quoting again, the expression negligible risk research describes research in which there is no foreseeable risk of harm or even discomfort, and any foreseeable risk is no more than inconvenience. And think about doing a survey, really probably all that causes you is a little bit of inconvenience. And some examples there of where the risk is only of inconvenience: filling in some sort of form, doing a survey while you're doing something else, and giving up some time to participate in research. When it comes to a participant being involved in a project, they need to give what's called informed consent. Reading directly from the national statement, consent should be a voluntary choice and should be based on sufficient information and adequate understanding of both the proposed research and the implications of participation in it. I've mentioned before about participant information sheets, what we do for projects, and it's part of the ethics process. So I have to have these written out before I even submit an ethics application. So a participant information sheet has, in plain language, a description of the project, exactly what the participants' involvement is in that project. So if they're doing interviews, talk about that, how long the interview will take, where it will take place, why we're doing the project, what will come out of the project for the participant, what happens to their data, whether I'm going to send transcripts out to them, or whether they're going to be informed of any publications and get a chance to be involved in that. So there's a whole, and even, so I should mention this point, and even the possibility that they might get distressed, particularly in the sorts of research that I've done in terms of the history of foster care project and the current project that I'm working on. So if there is a possibility that somebody might get upset because of being re-traumatized by the interview, that is covered in the participant information sheet. We list their support organisations and the fact, and we have a protocol as well. So if there is if somebody does get upset, and that has happened in interviews, then we stop the interview, make sure that the person is okay, make sure that they have support at home. If they I've never had anybody where the interview didn't continue. I had one situation where we decided to finish it, but we'd kind of got to the finish anyway. And it was certainly, the sadness in the atmosphere was certainly palpable when I asked the participant if she wanted to continue, and she said, no, I think it's time to finish. And that felt right to me. But as I said, we'd already been talking for an hour. But we do have a protocol developed so that if somebody is very upset, then we're not going to continue asking them for more information and risking further harm with that. So all of that is contained in a participant information, and then they can sign a consent form as well, so they know all about that project. There should be absolutely nothing that they're not aware of before they come in for an interview, or before I go visit them for an interview. When it comes to paying people to participate in research, what the national statement says is that it's generally appropriate to reimburse the cost of participants in taking part in the research, including travel, accommodation, parking costs. Sometimes participants may also be paid for time involved. However, payment that is disproportionate to the time involved, or any other inducement that is likely to encourage participants to take risks, is ethically unacceptable. For most of the big projects I've been involved in, there's been no exchange of money, but I have been involved in smaller projects. Also, those projects that I've talked about, the Christian Science project and the History of Foster Care project. I have been involved in smaller projects where we have given vouchers to people or paid them for some of that time. The inducement idea is very interesting, because there was a project that I was involved with out at Flinders University several years ago. We were interviewing working class women about their experience of university. We were going to pay them $100, which would cover the cost of the time involved in things like childcare, is what we were thinking of. But the ethics committee there said no, that was too much, and we had to take that down to $60 per person, and they all received a voucher for the $60. Sometimes it's just kind of token, $20 or $25, but that issue of cost is an interesting one. Are we actually paying for their time? I guess the ethics concern is whether we're trying to induce people to participate in research that may cause them some harm, and I can totally accept that is ethically unacceptable. For the History of Foster Care project, we didn't pay people for participating in the project, but what I did do, as I said, was offer everybody a book when the book was published. That was outside of the ethics application. It was never going to be part of that. It wasn't an inducement. It was something that I did at the end of that time, and at the end of that project, and at the end of the Christian Science project. It seemed to me the least that I could do, but it was never mentioned prior to the time that I sent them the book. When it comes to data management, that's a consideration for any ethics application as well. The questions that will be asked and you need to think about as who's got access to that data and how is it going to be analysed, how is it going to be stored, and again, who has access to it, how do the collection and the management of the data align with those ethical principles of respect, integrity, justice. Can participants still be identified even if they give you a pseudonym? In the case of Susan, when I came back to Australia, she received the transcript of the interview. Then later on, we started talking about how we'd tell her story for the book that came out of that project. One of the concerns that she had, a really super valid concern, is that in the Christian Science community, this community is so small that even if she had a pseudonym, she might still be identified. So the arrangement that we came to after months of going backwards and forwards via email was that we would tell her story in 3 parts, and in those 3 parts of the story locate her in different parts of the country. And for the story around the child sexual abuse, she was not, for the purposes of my project, she was not located in Illinois. So that's how we worked that one out. For the participants in the history of foster care, a similar sort of things. Some people didn't want to use pseudonyms, and that was fine, they gave their name. But what we decided to do was not mention the geographic place where people were located. So Debbie, for example, when she was talked about, and that was not the name that was used in the book, but when Debbie was talked about, she wasn't identified with South Australia at all. It was just Debbie. If you're going to be doing research with children, then there are some additional concerns that you need to be thinking about. Their capacity to understand, possible coercion, to participate on the part of maybe teachers or parents, and then conflicting values of children with parents as well. And that might mean that the parents don't want the child to be involved, but the child does want to be involved. You would normally have to get the consent of the parents as well as the child to participate in the project. I haven't done a great deal of research with children. One project that I recall, I was asked by an external to the University of Adelaide organisation to do an assessment of what's called residential care. So that's children who are under the guardianship of the state of South Australia, living away from their birth families in a suburban house. And there are workers who come in, they stay overnight and they come in through the day. And there's a variety of workers, so it's not like foster care where you have permanent carers. These are people travelling through, doing that as their job. So what I needed to do in that case was get the consent of the young person. These were young people from the age of 12 through to 17, and there were 2 houses that I was evaluating and 3 children living in each of those houses. So we call them young people probably at that age rather than children, even though they're technically still children. In that case, what I needed to do was get the consent of the young people, but also the consent of the social worker who was representing the state. And I liaised with the workers in the houses to do that. So once we had consent, then I went into those houses and met with those young people. And this was all, the ethics of that was complicated because it was the University of Adelaide ethics as well as the external organisation. A couple of concerns that I had with working with these young people was around whether the young people knew that the workers in each house were making extensive notes on these young people. So my concern wasn't with the young people, but whether they knew, whether they had been told by the organisation. My other concern was the way in which the notes were written up. There seemed to be a lot of judgment about the young people being conveyed. So there was one example where a young girl was on the phone with her mother. She wanted her mother to come visit, and that was described in the reports as that young person being very manipulative, which is quite negative way of describing somebody. And so my ethical dilemma was, do I raise this with these two concerns with the external organisation? I did both of those. Did they have, in terms of whether they had informed the young people that they were keeping extensive notes on them, I went to various external organisations and sought some advice there. Places like the Australian Association of Social Workers, the Australian Association of Psychologists, and the Australian government as well, and they all suggested that the ethical thing to do was that if you're making notes about people, you tell them you're making notes about them, and if they want to see those notes, then they're entitled to see them. So having all that background, I did actually let the organisation know that I did have a concern about that. They never told me actually whether they had informed those young people, but I suspected that they did not. I also then raised the concern about the way in which those notes were written, and I have a concern about that because at some point those young people might want to go back and view them and they'll see all that negative judgment. Plus it concerned me just that negative judgment in and of itself. So my concern was reporting on that. I did report on it knowing that that might in the future mean that I don't have any work with that external organisation. But I thought, for me, it was more important that the young people were treated with the utmost respect. And there were two examples there where I didn't think they were. If you're going to be doing research with First Nations people, then you need to be thinking about their core values, which are number one, spirit and integrity, which is very central, and that's an ongoing connection and continuity. Respectful and honourable behaviours, that's absolutely core and number one for them. Number two is cultural continuity, so maintaining bonds between people and the environment as well. Equity is the third point, a commitment to fairness and justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Number four is reciprocity, so that's equal rights in relationships, recognising all contributions to any project and making sure that benefits are shared equally as well. Number five is respect, that there's a regard, and I'm quoting, for welfare rights, knowledge, skills, beliefs, perceptions, customs and cultural heritage, both individual and collective, of the people involved in the research. And finally, this responsibility to do no harm and to share responsibilities within the group. I haven't done specific research with First Nations people. I don't have any particular stories to tell you about that, but do be aware of those additional core values that you need to be taking into account, and the guidelines for ethical conduct, specifically for working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities. That's a lot of things to be thinking about, but it's really important that you do give that thinking serious consideration to the ethics of doing research. I'm going to hand the last word over to Johnny Saldana, which is where we started out. He writes, and I quote, "Remember that the root meaning of datum is something given, not something collected." And just as an aside, that's besides the fact that I usually say data collection. But anyway, to come back to Johnny Saldana, anything your participants give you in the form of interviews, observation opportunities, documents, and so on, should be seen not just as data, but as gifts. They are giving the researcher, most often voluntarily, their time, knowledges, experiences and insights. Participants sacrifice their privacy so that the researcher can learn from them, not about them. Respect and honour the people you study, for they are willingly vulnerable for you. Thank you for listening.